Hello and welcome to this naval history trip down memory lane. I'm Bill Marcroft, and today I'll be talking about HMAS NIRIMBA and the Royal Australian Navy Apprentice Training Establishment, or RANATE as it's commonly known. I'll be focusing on the early years from 1956 until around 1966. The many photos you'll see are some from my own time at NIRIMBA as an apprentice, and many others kindly donated by other former apprentices that span NIRIMBA's first decade of training. A quick history of the NIRIMBA location. It was built in 1942 as the RAF Schofield's auxiliary air base to RAF Richmond. And in 1944, it was transferred to the Royal Navy as a Fleet Air Arm support base known as HMS Nabthorpe. And from 1949 to 51, it was partly used by as the Schofield Migrant Hospital, hostel for around 300 European migrants. And after 1953, it was commissioned as NIRIMBA for use as the RAN aircraft repair yard. And then, that apparently that wasn't used entirely up until the changeover period to NIRIMBA apparently went into care and maintenance, I've read. In January 1956, NIRIMBA was recommissioned as the RAN Apprentice Training Establishment. And in 56, the initial intake of 50 apprentices came to NIRIMBA. So that was really the beginning of NIRIMBA as a training establishment. And they were followed by 6 monthly intakes in January and July. And in 1966, NIRIMBA went into a restructuring process, and that's when things started to change there. And the 1966 restructuring commenced with the 15th entry leaving NIRIMBA at 3.5 years rather than the previously planned 4 years. And that was the entry that I was in. And in 1994, NIRIMBA was decommissioned with all technical training transferred down to HMAS service. So it's one of those places that had a little bit of history to it. This photo here, these two photos on the left-hand side, gives a good aerial view of NIRIMBA during the 1940s. And on the right-hand side, you can see the actual base area, the accommodation area. You can see a little bit of a view of the hangars and other features of what the establishment looks like from overhead. It didn't really change all that much over the years. As in this current year, 2025, the 1950s was a period of global tension, then known as the Cold War. And the Royal Navy, Australian Navy, ordered and started building new ships. And the Defence Forces had to compete to find the skilled people to man those ships. So that was a problem, and exactly the same as we're finding now. Traditional Royal Navy and civilian recruitment sources had declined because the RAN used to bring in quite a lot of people from the Royal Navy back in those days. And the RM was also expanding as well, so they couldn't get people. And the same problem was occurring all across Australia. Other major organisations had already initiated large in-house apprentice schemes. And in 1953, the RAN Naval Board decided to open an apprentices training school. That was their only way of getting the numbers. These are the ships that were ordered during the 1950s. There were 4 Darings ordered, and other ships, the Type 12s, Sydney and Melbourne were coming along. So with Sydney and Melbourne, there was a number of aircraft, with regards to the Fleet Air Arm expanding. So it was a requirement that really required a broader range of technical skills. And this is the real problem, finding the technical skills for a modern Navy. The main skills that were required for NIRIMBA, for the fleet basically, were the engine room artificers and particularly the ordnance artificers. They were the larger numbers because if you look at the machinery and the weapon systems, they were very much mechanical systems, and they needed large numbers of people, and it was a major problem. The electrical artificers were also another issue, which obviously more and more equipment was becoming electrically and electronically oriented. And of course, the naval shipwrights are always a requirement because there were hull issues to constantly maintain. Civilian trade alignments were going to be offered for all of the people coming to NIRIMBA, and that was through the Sydney Technical College. Recruitment of apprentices. The apprentices were recruited from all around Australia, and as such, they came from various states, different types of people, and advertising was pretty widely done. It was a competitive process to get in, quite considerable sort of detail went into it. There were fitness checks and health tests and psychological tests and so on. And NIRIMBA's commanding officer led a group of people around the country doing face-to-face interviews, trying to select the final group of people that would come to NIRIMBA. So it was a fairly detailed process. This is the first intake of 50 apprentices, and some of those people went on to become senior officers, Captain Brian Swan and various other people along the way. So you find that as a result, this particular group went a long way, and that was the start of it. Their initial engagement was for 12 years, and the apprentices joining were between 16 and 17 years old. And NIRIMBA was not too far from Sydney. It was out near Blacktown, a place called Quakers Hill, and that was fairly accessible. RANATE was basically modelled on the Royal Navy's own Royal Navy Apprentice Training Establishment, which had been established in 1903, and it had gone through quite a number of changes and moved from one establishment to another. So it was an evolutionary process. NIRIMBA was really run like a unique hybrid naval establishment, and as such, it was structured like a private boarding school. And in reality, the apprentices area was really a separate area within the establishment. Ship's company couldn't go into it and that type of thing. So it was a separate area. There were no fences, but people couldn't go in there. Secondary education continues, and there was a school block there. So a lot of the apprentices would have thought that they'd left school, but they had a surprise once they got to NIRIMBA. And the trade training was based on a curriculum agreed with Sydney Technical College. And branch technical education was largely done by marine and electrical engineering officers who came from the fleet, and they did the face-to-face training on the branch technical training. And then, of course, there are other areas. There was the training from the point of view of the trade training, which was done by civilian training instructors. When the initial apprentices got to NIRIMBA, the 50 original apprentices, they really saw a place that was still in the making. They spent a lot of their time sort of over on the far side of the airstrip in what was known as 259 building. But they found that there was still a lot of naval aircraft around the establishment. They were being prepared to be moved out to Albatross down at Nowra. So as a result, it was a place that was in evolutionary change, and those apprentices actually helped to do some of the work around the place as it went on. This is the uniforms that the apprentices got, and this is where the place starts to get quite interesting, because you can see there that they're basically not the normal range of sailors' uniforms. Very similar to, if you like, what you'd expect petty officers, as you see on the left-hand side, and also the apprentice in the blazer and greys, what you would expect down at Creswell at the RAN Naval College. And as I said previously, it was really a hybrid establishment, and there were a lot of similarities between NIRIMBA and Creswell, particularly as the way the place was run. But yeah, the uniforms was quite a significant change from the normal naval establishment as such. The apprentices were all issued with a blazer and greys, and the blazer was a tailored thing. The tailors were there when the uniforms were being issued, and as such, everything was done to a reasonably high standard. And the blazer and greys was very similar to the RAN Naval College. The first thing that the apprentices started to come to grips with, it was a new way of life. The first 6 weeks, quite intensive induction and basic training. The basics of naval life and discipline were quickly learnt. Punishments were quite freely given out, but they were fair and they weren't unreasonable. All movements around Nirimba were in working hours in class groups, so it didn't matter where you went. It was never just a stroll. It was always a controlled group. Class leaders were always held responsible for orderly marching and doubling, and there was no talking or skylarking or anything like that. And they didn't get away with much because there were always chief petty officers and petty officers constantly monitoring poor discipline and watching what was going on. If something happened and people were skylarking in a group while they were moving around, a constant thing was that the apprentices would be stopped by the person that spotted them, and they'd be sent for a nice double across the airfield or perhaps down to the sick bay, which was a fair distance, and come back and report to me. So the class leaders quickly learnt to control managed groups of people, and team building was one of those things that came out of that. They learned how to take control, and the class leaders were swapped around very, very regularly. As a result, everyone got to have a little bit of training, if you like, from that point of view, in taking control. The accommodation that the apprentices saw was very, very basic. These were the old World War II huts, very simple, galvanised iron huts. They were lined with masonite, nothing elaborate. There was no insulation. They were freezing cold in winter, really hot in summer, and you found that there were problems with regards to mosquitoes in summer. And as you'll see in this one, the mosquito nets are up there on the left-hand side. You couldn't sleep without mosquito nets. The place was absolutely covered in them. So as a result, it was a fairly basic sort of a situation. These huts normally had about 20 apprentices per hut. And there was an apprentice, senior apprentice, had a cabin at the end of the hut, and he was in control. The shower blocks were a short walk away. They were, again, very basic, corrugated iron buildings, no tiles, no partitions between the showers, just a row of shower heads, and extremely basic. Access was an open walk from the huts, and just thongs and towel around you, and that was it. Not very nice in wet weather, particularly if it was cold and wet. Hot water was always a problem, usually ran out on a regular basis. And as a result, you found, see on the right-hand side there, the hot water was supplied by a coke-fired boiler, which had to be stoked by a civilian contractor or one of their civilian employees. And if he was a little bit late starting, the water was cold and it would run out quite quickly. Basic training, the first 6 weeks, a mixture of things were done, but effectively it was probably very similar to what many of the training establishments, the junior recruits probably would have gone through a somewhat similar thing. There was basic seamanship, there was an assault course, there was early morning PT. The senior apprentices from the huts took the groups, so that you found that there were small groups of apprentices spread out around the airfield area doing PT in the morning. And the apprentices basically went through a range of very sort of, I suppose, confronting things to them at the beginning. But one of the things they all did, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the apprentices in the basic fitting shop. All of the trades for the first 6 months did the same trade training, basic hand tools, basic trade training. And that really gave the Navy the ability to have a look at people's skills, their hand skills, and at the same time they were going to the school block doing lessons. So they were assessed for the next first 6 months before they were allocated a permanent trade alignment. The apprentices obviously came together and they made a lot of friends. In the very early 6 months there, people were in close together, constantly moving around in groups, doing things together. And those friendships have endured even up until this day. There are email groups and various activities taking place right up to this day, even from the first term apprentices. This was one of the regulating chief petty officers, a well-known character by the name of Nobby Clark. He was a chief mechanical engineer or chief stoker, and he became quite a mentor to the apprentices, a rather fearsome person in those days. But he kept the apprentices in line, and he would appear at all hours of the day. He just seemed to appear from nowhere, but he was a very, very entertaining sort of person, and he really knew what was going on. He'd served in the Royal Navy during the Second World War, so he was well experienced at sea. The Mobies, the name Moby, it came up during the second term. Nobody seems to be extremely sure where that name came from, but it started in the second term, as I've been reliably informed, and the Mobies, most objectionable bastards imaginable, and a little bit like the Rats of Tobruk. They took it really as a name of bonding, something that they thought was a very good identity, and it's stuck to this day, and they now all refer to themselves as Mobies. And the important thing is it only refers to the apprentices that were in the original 5-year apprenticeship scheme, which went from 1956 to 1972. So it doesn't apply to the sales-struck apprentices. After the first 6 months, the apprentices were moved out of the training huts, which were really very close to the regulating office, so they were in very close supervision. And they moved into other huts. Some of them went into similar long broadside huts, and others went into four-man cabins. It really depended on the amount of accommodation that was available for the various divisions, and this was quite a variable over the years too. Some of the four-man cabins, as you'll see there, that's the basic layout for each person, bunk, a chair, and the chair will get a mention later on. You'll note the ventilation under the door. The places were very, very roughly built during World War II, very, very basic. The huts were looked after by the apprentices. They had a patch of lawn and a little bit of a garden, and the apprentices regularly had to keep a good control over that and make sure it was kept clean and tidy. They had bare timber floors. Very narrow strip of linoleum went from the door right through across the cabin, and that had to be waxed on once a month for captain's rounds. And all of the huts were inspected by the officer of the day every night. So every hut there was a duty sweeper, and the apprentice would have to stand by, report for rounds, and the officer of the day would look through the cabins and make sure everything was neat and tidy. It would have been quite a walk for the officer of the day. The apprentices' cafeteria is again a very plain fibro-clad building, and it was one of those places, once again, bare timber floors. They got waxed out once a week by the apprentices on the duty watch, and they were first-term apprentices that did that. The food was all cooked by Navy cooks. I believe these days they're nearly all contractors, whereas there were Navy cooks there, and some of those cooks, the apprentices got to know them over time, and eventually ended up serving on ships with them at sea. The first-term apprentices primarily looked after the cafeteria. They were there at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and they basically did the serving out on the servery, did the dishwashing, cleared the tables, and kept the place clean and tidy. So it was really the whole place was run to some extent by the apprentices, or they provided the labour. This is a picture of the first intake, apprentices that were having their breakfast or having a meal there, and they had fairly good appetites. The food was quite plentiful and nutritious. There was usually opportunities for second courses, and in winter there was fruitcake and hot chocolate served, commonly known in the Navy as kai, and it happened on ships at sea in winter in cold areas. The apprentices responsible for their own ironing, washing, and there were clotheslines spread out around the establishment in a variety of areas. There was also an apprentice's laundry where there were washing machines available, and there was also a drying room attached to that. And if the apprentices wanted to, there was a bag wash laundry, which was actually run almost as, if you like, an after-school type job by the apprentices. And they were paid by the apprentices fund as well. So you drop your bag in and picked it up the next day. If you went to do your washing and the washing machines were all used, well, the standby was a pogo stick in the bucket. And that was really the fallback for quite a lot of occasions. And if you wanted to do a small load, it was quite a useful thing to do, not a problem at all. And this was a system that was used on board ships quite often. The apprentices' canteen was right down at the bottom of the accommodation area, and it sold the usual range of toiletries and soft drinks and confectionery and so on. And eventually they started selling sausage rolls and various things like that. And despite being well fed, the apprentices used to descend upon their stand easy in the mornings, and they'd be buying their meat pies and sausage rolls as well. So it's a little bit like 16 and 17-year-olds and up to 20-year-olds. They got ferocious appetites. There was a lot of activity, and the money that was made from the apprentice canteen went into the apprentices fund, and then that was then funneled into areas for recreation and so on, sporting gear and the movies and other activities that went towards providing facilities for the apprentices. On this close end, there was a recreation room and TV and so on. And on the far end, you can see another building, and that was the billiards room. So had two large full-size billiards tables in there. The hub of NIRIMBA's control was the regulating office, and that's in the end there, just where it's notated there. That's where the regulating chief and the regulating staff actually work from, very, very close to the apprentices' accommodation. And the next building along, there was a seamstress in there, and the seamstress had a non-stop parade of clothes going through, tears and adjustments, and people were growing, and waistlines were adjusted outwards as these young apprentices grew. So it was quite a range of activities taking place. And then you see the larger building there was the cinema, and the cinema was a multi-purpose building. And we'll look at that a bit more closely now. It really got used for a range of activities. Initially, it was the only gymnasium. It did get used some gymnasium use later on, as a hangar had been made available with a basketball court inside, which we'll look at that later on. There were twice weekly movies, and as I mentioned before, chairs. You had to bring your own chair because there were no chairs in the cinema, or there was a small handful, but you took your own chair up. There were dances on alternate Thursday nights, and blood donations. The Red Cross came along about once a term, and the band practiced in there occasionally as well. The dancing lessons. The dancing lessons were basically one of those things that it was voluntary. If you wanted to go, you can go, but you had to be in full uniform. They're fairly closely supervised. There were ships, the regulating staff normally had somebody there, and you had the dancing teacher, and also the chaplain used to appear on occasions as well. So mainly they didn't want the apprentices leaving the area at night time with the girls. So the girls had been picked up from Blacktown and Seven Hills stations by Navy buses. There were set pickup and drop-off times. And as a result, things just moved along. The apprentices had their own band, and obviously as terms passed out, the members changed. And you found that the band was one of those things that provided the rock music, and the teachers brought along records that had conventional, traditional dancing music on it. The dancing lessons developed into other things because the dancing teachers also were teaching classes elsewhere, including debutantes. And the debutantes obviously needed partners, and the dancing teachers somehow decided that the apprentices probably made up a good bunch of partners, because obviously all well dressed, all in uniform, they knew how they danced. So as a result, a number of the apprentices moved on to taking on the debutante balls. And this particular group, I understand, went to about 3 deb balls a year. They'd practice for about 8 weeks for each of the groups, and go off and do the deb ball, and then they'd be onto the cycle again for another lot. So it was one of those things that it was a variation, and a number of the apprentices actually met their future wives at the dancing lessons or through the deb balls. Nirimba had a sick bay, which originally started off as the sick quarters at the RAF station, and it was only a 10-bed sick bay, fairly basic. There was no heating, cooling, blinds or curtains, and pretty much bare floors throughout. The medical officer had daily sick parade, and they provided the sniffles and injuries and things like that were attended to. And there was a matron there. She looked after the actual ward at the sick bay, a 10-bed ward. And at the end of the sick bay, there was a separate building, and it had the dental clinic in it. And all of the apprentices, injections were basically done on a rotational basis as they needed them. The same with visits to the dentist. The dentist obviously saw everyone, did dental inspections and checkups, and did whatever's required. And the apprentices got very, very good medical attention and dental care. The logistics at Nirimba was quite a complex issue. When you think of it, it was an establishment that grew quite quickly, and because it had a mixture of not just the apprentices, but the Navy provided much of the resources, the facilities, all of the cooks, the stores people looking after the various stores activities, the medical branch providing obviously people for the sick bay and the dental surgery. There were miscellaneous branches like the PTIs, the gunnery drill instructors, the band master, various other people. There were 2 chaplains, a naval Anglican chaplain and Roman Catholic chaplain. There were instructors officers. These naval instructor officers were basically known as schoolies, and then you had the training officers for the technical areas, which were marine and weapons electrical engineering officers. There were civilian instructors, and some of those were former RAN and RN senior sailors, and others had come straight out of industry. A very talented bunch of people, but overall a very large place, and it took a lot of people to make it actually work. There were 2 chapels, an Anglican chapel and a Roman Catholic chapel, and they were both done quite separately. There was compulsory church on Sundays for anyone that was on board, so the apprentices all had to get into their dress uniforms, and they were off to chapel for Sunday prayers. You had no choice about it. The regulating staff would go through and make sure all the accommodation was cleared. Some apprentices used to like to climb up into the roof spaces to try and avoid it. And it was one of those places that had, particularly in the early days, a pretty good inclination towards making sure that the apprentices' religious needs were followed. Nirimba had really a big sporting culture associated with it. It was really a major part of how the place actually run. And because of the large flat airfield, there was a wide range of playing fields that could be accommodated there. And very much like a private school or even most high schools, each of the divisions had their own colours. And 4 days after week, there was organised sport. Names went up on the notice board. You'd go and have a look at the notice board and find out what sport you were going to play that day. It could be rugby or soccer or hockey or Aussie rules. It was really the luck of the draw. So everybody got to play all the different sports because you had people that came from all the different states, and obviously they'd played different codes. So there was mix and match. On Fridays, it was somewhat different. There was usually a cross-country run, and that went up to about 9 kilometres. It was outside the establishment and out around Schofields and back down the far end of the airfield, and when everyone got back, the apprentices had to battle to find a shower. But the sports equipment for the apprentices was paid for by the apprentices fund, so there was never any shortage of sporting equipment. And the apprentices got involved in various sports, with inter-service sport with Navy, Army and Air Force apprentices. They also got involved in various Sydney competitions in the Sydney metropolitan area, and on occasions they also played with various private schools. So they got around. This picture here gives you a rough idea of the vastness of the place with regards to the playing fields. There were a couple of rugby fields, a hockey field, a soccer field, a full-size Aussie rules field. Later on, from 1963 onwards, a full-size athletics track was built with apprentice labour, I might add, using Saturday morning working parties. And there were volleyball courts and indoor basketball courts, and a gymnasium in the hangar. And also there was a short pistol range down the far end of the establishment. So there was variety. The sort of sports were quite variable. I've mentioned the major codes, but there are also specialised sports that came up from time to time, and they really were dependent on quite often particular officers or senior sailors, or even some of the civilian instructors having a particular interest in these sports and being prepared to run the activities. So you saw a variety of different sports, and it was always a moving thing. As I said earlier, Nirimba was an evolutionary place, so it was always in a state of constant change. Sporting teams, as I mentioned, there were sporting teams organised for a whole range of organised sports outside of the establishment. I've mentioned inter-service sports, but there were the Sydney competitions and also with private schools. So this will give you an idea of some of the teams, and they were well run, well organised, and really not a lot different to what people would have experienced if they'd been in a private school. There was a set of tennis courts there just across the road from the accommodation area near the first and second term huts, always available, and they were used to a reasonable degree by the apprentices. The original swimming pool at Nirimba was pretty basic. It was like a sunken barge, and I think the original purpose might have been to actually test out the boats that the shipwrights built as part of their training. They built small pram dinghies and things like that, so they had to be tested, but the apprentices also used it as well. It was a pretty basic and murky sort of a place. You can see on the left-hand side and on the top right-hand side there, you can see the steel structure around it, but in later years, I believe a coping was put on it, which made it a bit more attractive and a lot safer, but it wasn't particularly a place where people sort of would go and congregate to any great extent, except in really, really hot weather. When the apprentices wanted to do their, or needed to do their swimming qualification tests, they were bussed over to the swimming pool at RAF Richmond, which was a full-size Olympic pool, so they had a really nice pool there. On Fridays, sometimes there was mass PT, and the apprentices would gather down on one of the parade areas, and as you can see in the background there, you can see through the hangar, and you can see the backboards for the volleyball, and the ropes also hanging down, climbing ropes. And it was a relatively basic gymnasium when you look at gymnasiums today. You know, there was a bolting horse and wall racks and things like that, and springboard and so on. So it was pretty much the sort of the equipment you see out there on the program that was being used. First term apprentices, mid-term long weekends. There are about 200 apprentices would be normally bussed in a convoy to places like Jervis Bay, and Jervis Bay was one of those places that the apprentices were let loose for the long weekend. They were given 4-man ration packs each, and they'd normally go and bunch together in small groups, create themselves a hut from the ground sheets they were given, and have a good time. Boats were borrowed from across the bay from the Naval College, They'd go fishing and exploring around the area, and generally speaking, a good weekend was had by all. Short leave and holidays. The first term apprentices had no weekend leave for the first 6 weeks, and then after that it was quite restricted anyway. And apprentices kept duties every fourth day and every fourth weekend, so they were always going to be they had no weekend leave until sixth term, no midweek leave until sixth term. However, with the leave and so on, the apprentices had considerable restrictions. They had Saturday morning working parties, so you found that usually the lower terms were required on board until 12 o'clock on Saturday, and that's how the places like the athletics track got built. And under 18 apprentices required a parental overnight approved address, and that approved address was something that basically required the apprentice to get an address, get their parents or guardian to sign, and then they were allowed to have overnight leave. If they didn't have that, the under 18s couldn't go ashore for the weekend. They had to be back by 10 o'clock. Initially, blazer and greys were the uniform for going ashore, and only senior terms had midweek leave after sixth term. All the apprentices had 6 weeks annual leave, very much like school holidays, if you like, 2 weeks mid-year, 4 weeks at the end of the year. Back in the early days, there was no plane travel, so the apprentices travelled by train. So the Western Australians, for example, could have 10 days travel time. So it was a fairly long break for them. There were always set times for leave, whether it was short leave or long leave, and anyone who was late back was immediately disciplined from the point of view of they would appear before the officer of the day on the Monday, and they would suffer the consequences. All movement in and out of Nirimba was covered by what they were called short leave cards, which was a system used in the Navy anyway, so you always knew who'd gone out and who'd come back. Duties were quite variable, but this was one of the more unusual ones. There was a manual telephone exchange, and that telephone exchange was normally operated by a civilian receptionist during the day, and at 5 o'clock she obviously knocked off, and a sixth-term apprentice took over. And the apprentice got to sleep in the telephone exchange at night. There was a bed there that made sure he was available to take the calls as they came through the night. And there's no way he was going to miss it, because there was a large bell up in the rafters, and it would wake anybody. And basically, a long weekend, the apprentice would be there for the entire weekend, and he'd just get relieved. Occasionally, somebody would come and relieve him for a short period while he went and had his meals, and he was there for the weekend. Nirimba had a pig farm, and like any of the larger naval establishments, large amounts of food waste were generated. The scrapings from the cafeteria and leftovers from the galley and so on. And at Nirimba, what happened was that the food scraps were kept in, or they're collected in bins, and at night time, apprentices were driven around. There was a sixth-term apprentice drove what was called the sullage truck, and the sullage truck went to all of the cafeterias, not just the apprentices' cafeteria, but also the ship's company, the wardroom, the senior sailors' cafe, and they'd pick up the scraps in bins, put the bins on the back of the truck, and take them over to the pig farm and collect clean bins, which the pig farmer had cleaned out, and then bring them back to cafeterias. When a litter of pigs, occasionally the apprentices would be asked to go and keep watch on the litter to allow the pig farmer to get a bit of sleep. So the apprentice started to get a little bit of practice with regards to watch keeping, I suppose you could say, in a roundabout way. The pig farm was eventually closed. The feeding of swill to pigs was banned by state law, and that was the end of the pig farm. Training was always naval oriented. Didn't matter which way you went in the establishment. It was always full naval traditions were followed. Even though it was a training school, an apprentices school, they were still permanent members of the Defence Force. And as such, they learned everything that the Navy did. So what you see here is apprentices doing rifle on guard and so on, and flags being taken during a ceremonial period as passing out parade. So things varied slightly over the years, but the original parade ground was next to the tennis courts, and in later years it was moved out onto the airfield. What you're seeing here is a passing out parade, and those apprentices, you might just be able to see that they've on their left-hand sleeves, they've now got to hook their killix, and they're about to enter their 5th year as apprentices and leave Nirimba and go to sea. And of course, everything that was done in Nirimba was accompanied by the band. So there was always a garden band every morning. The apprentices gathered on the parade ground. There was a period where, short period at the beginning, where divisional officers could talk to each of their divisions, tell them anything they needed, and then the garden band did what guards and bands normally did. They had a march past at the end, and all of the apprentices marched past as well. That happened every morning. One of the interesting things about the band, the instruments had originally been donated by the residents of Adelaide to the band of HMAS Adelaide. And so that was back in 1925. So after all those years, the instruments were still available for use. Nirimba's band originally started as a small drum and bugle corps, and the band developed over a period of time. I suppose as they got more and more terms coming in, it was one of those things. They had more people that showed an interest in becoming band members. So a full-size band was actually implemented, and you normally had around about 30-odd people in the band, and there was a musician from the musicians branch was assigned to Nirimba. Normally could have been a chief petty officer, and on one occasion a senior leading hand. And they were the bandmaster and instructor. And as a result, the Nirimba band got used in quite a few areas. This particular picture, they're marching down George Street during an apprenticeship week, and that happened on a number of occasions. And you can see the apprentices marching along behind them as well. They had other amenities at Nirimba besides the, if you like, the training amenities. There was an apprentices maintenance garage, because a number of the apprentices had cars, second-hand cars, and they like to do their own maintenance. So as a result, an area was set aside, and that over a period of time, the apprentices, using volunteer labour, actually built up a garage area in the space that's shown on this photo here. There was an apprentice's quiet room and library, which was developed fairly early on, and in later years that was actually turned into a senior apprentices bar, where the 7th and 8th term apprentices basically had bar privileges. Bearing in mind at this stage they were all over 18 and starting to become adults, and it discouraged people from trying to hop over the fence and head out to the local pub. So it was one of those things that made life a little bit more pleasant for the apprentices, and also helped to keep them in under control. There was a dark room which was down the bottom of the establishment near the band store, and that was equipped by the apprentices fund with chemicals and photo paper. So it was free for use, and apprentices could use that as they saw fit. There was a transport compound. The transport compound had a variety of vehicles. There were buses and trucks and cranes and tractor and a fire truck. The fire truck originally came from the airfield use, and that stayed there as such. And the fire truck was normally driven by sailors from the marine engineering branch, but the apprentices drove the salvage truck and the tractor, and they were pretty much the only vehicles that the apprentices had access to. The apprentices, like all people in the Navy, they had to have a civilian driver's license, but they then all had to do a separate test to get a Navy driver's license. Secondary education was something that probably surprised many of the apprentices when they first went to NIRIMBA. There was a school block on the far side of the airfield, and it was run very much just like a school. And you found that there were a number of classrooms, there was a lecture theatre there, and most of the training, in fact, all of the training was done by naval instructor officers, and these were effectively school teachers. And the school curriculum effectively was based on the Navy's higher educational test, and that covered a range of basic subjects, if you like, Maths 1, Maths 2, chemistry, physics, and technical drawing was also part of it, but that was more of a trade subject. But the HET subjects, out of interest, were a prerequisite for commissioned rank, and I'll mention that a little bit later on, but a number of the apprentices went on to commissioned rank. As you see here, there's various subjects being taught there, and one of the things that the Navy was particularly keen on, they'd made a pretty big investment into getting these apprentices into NIRIMBA. There were regular exams, and poor results led to extra study classes, and those extra study classes were done at night time, and there was usually an instructor there, and it wasn't just in the schoolwork, but the extra study classes came about for trade subjects as well. Trade and technical branch theory. All trades undertaken at NIRIMBA met the requirements of the New South Wales trades certification requirements. So the NIRIMBA was actually an outpost of Sydney Technical College. It was formerly aligned with Sydney Tech. And trade theory lessons were carried out by civilian instructors at NIRIMBA, whereas trade theory subjects were taken to normal TAFE standards. So the apprentices had to follow a syllabus that was agreed to with the TAFE people, and they had to maintain the standards that were required. As I mentioned previously, extra study classes were involved if they didn't meet the required standards, and if you continued to fail in subjects at the end of the term, you ran the risk of being backclassed, and that did happen to a reasonable number of apprentices. It wasn't something that the Navy was going to get rid of people. They made sure they'd put a big investment in, and they persevered with them. And there were apprentices along the way that actually got backclassed and eventually became quite senior officers. So perseverance was obviously the name of the game. Engineering subjects relating to their naval branch category, whether they were going to become engineers, like with the engine room artificers or ordnance artificers for the weapons branch. The engineering subjects were taught by engineering officers from the relevant branches. They had sea experience, they knew what it was about, and they were able to pass on the knowledge and make sure that the apprentices got a reasonable basic understanding of the theory and the principles of operation of the various pieces of equipment. A lot of the big exhibits and some of the training, particularly the branch training, technical subjects, was carried on in what was known as 259 building, and this was a large hangar. It was on the far side of the airfield, right next to the railway line and very close to the school block. And as you see in the photo there were annexes on the side, and there were classrooms and workshops in those annexes. Inside the building itself, there were large exhibits. There was a full-size Admiralty 3-drum boiler came out of a destroyer, and that was accessible from the point of view that you can see in the top right-hand corner.
you can walk into the furnace, and the instructors could show people what the features of a boiler were, what the tubes look like, and the refractory bricks and other features inside the furnace. But there are other large pieces of equipment. In the bottom middle picture there, you'll see there's turbines from a destroyer. So the apprentices could be shown exactly what the turbine looked like and how they functioned. There were gun mountings there. There was a 40-60 mounting and another mounting as well. And in the workshops off to the side, there was also a laboratory there where they could do testing of diesel fuel injectors and things like that. So you found that there were demonstration exhibits that enabled the instructors to move from the classroom straight out into an area where they could show real pieces of equipment. And here's a few more views of some of those pieces of equipment. The top left-hand corner, that's the Admiralty 3-drum boiler that I referred to. Very similar to what was on the Melbourne, in fact, as well. And there are other things. The boiler water drum that you can see on the top right-hand side there, there's an apprentice actually working inside it. Had to remove tubes and fit new tubes. They're only stubs, but they learnt the principles of doing a little bit of boiler making in reality. There are electrical pieces of equipment, motor generators and switchboards and things like that. Bottom right-hand corner, you can see a bunch of ordnance artificer apprentices doing drill inside a mounting. Workshops. The workshops were largely based on the engineering trades, mechanical fitters and turners and boilermakers, and also the shipwrights. And when you look at the size of these workshops, the main machine shop, it filled an entire hangar. A large number of lathes, the milling machines, boring machines, grinding machines, a whole broad range of machines. And the main machine that the apprentices used to a very large extent were lathes. And the lathe was the common machine that was on pretty much most ships, except the very tiny ones. The patrol boats obviously didn't have one, but when you got onto a frigate or a destroyer, there was always a lathe. And that was essential for carrying out maintenance on board. But there were a variety of different workshops. There was a blacksmith shop and there's a plumber's shop and various other shops that were specialised. When you look at some of those shops, they were very well equipped. The welding shop had a whole range of equipment in it. And the apprentices did what they referred to as allied trades training. Now, the allied trades training was a variable. Different trades quite often did a reasonable amount of training in trades that were associated with their base trade. So the fitters and turners, for example, which was the ERAs and also the ordnance artificers, they got quite a range of skills, but the amount of allied trade training was somewhat mixed between the different trades. So there were modules that applied to some trades, but not others. So the shipwrights did some of these as well. So there was a well-equipped plumbing shop and also a blacksmith shop. And the blacksmith shop had a machine forge in it, electrically driven forge. There were a number of hearths there, so the apprentices learned how to do hand forging. The only ships that I ever came across that had a blacksmith shop was, strangely, the Sydney and the Melbourne. They had one situated underneath the island area. But the main reason they had to have these allied trades were you didn't have all trades at sea. And when something went wrong, you had to be capable of doing things using whatever resources were available. So with having a basic understanding in some of these trades, they were able to do the other trades. So they could do welding and they could do brazing and various activities like that. They were all going to be chief petty officers in the not too distant future. And as a result, they needed to have a good understanding of the broad variety of skills because they'd be looking after jobs on board for themselves, but also coordinating certain activities during refit periods. So they need to be able to talk to the dockyard people. The various workshops, as you can see, top left-hand corner was the basic fitting shop, and we saw an earlier picture there where the apprentices, all of the apprentices in the first term, spent their first 6 months in the basic fitting shop. They didn't go into the machine shops or anywhere else. Everything was done in the basic fitting shop. And the tolerances that they had to work for within their jobs, using only basic hand tools, no micrometers, no vernier calipers, was 2/1000ths of an inch, plus or minus 2/1000ths of an inch. And I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. But they did plate metal work and various other things. So as you can see there's a range of things. After they got into second term and onwards, bottom right-hand corner, there was a separate fitting shop, and the apprentices still did various jobs that required hand fitting, and a very significant requirement looking after both not only the engineering equipment in engine rooms and boiler rooms, but also in the turrets and various gunnery and weapon systems. There was a marking room, and as I mentioned before, plus or minus 2/1000ths of an inch was the basic tolerance for the fitters and turners, and they were kept to it. And the marking room was set up right at the beginning, and there's a staff in there with all of the right gear to mark all of the jobs. Every job that was done had a time limit on it. Every job had set requirements with regards to not only the tolerances, but the finishes and the fit and so on. And they were all marked and checked in the marking room. And as a result, those marks were all recorded. So as you see here, here's one job that sort of went through. The apprentice receives a rough forged piece of material. This was called a gudgeon end. And that's what it looks like at the end after it's spent many, many hours being made up on the, mainly it was all done on a lathe, in fact. So when it was finished, it went to the marking room, and the marking staff then checked the job over, and might be able to see it there. There's a sheet underneath. It's got every tolerance and every dimension on it. They're all checked, they're all recorded, and it became part of the apprentices, if you like, marking towards their end of term marks. The best jobs, this was the top mark for each term. For the different jobs, they went into the showcase, and they were there for the 6 months duration, and they were on display for everyone to see. So it was a pretty broad range of jobs. The Shipwrights, they had their own workshop, once again, a hangar, and it was boat building, not only timber, but steel and also fiberglass. And the Shipwrights had a pretty extensive range of areas that they were trained in, because ships were different. There were different types of ship, different sizes of ships, so the shipwrights had to be fairly flexible. They had very good grounding in ship design, ship stability, how to run slipways, because when you start to look at some of the smaller bases, slipways are in use, and the shipwrights had to be able to do that. So they become almost the dock masters were being trained at that stage. One of the interesting things, the boat on the bottom left-hand corner, a district officer's boat, that was a motorboat that had been built back in the 1930s at Garden Island for use up in PNG, when there were very few roads in those days, and there were a few of these around, and that one now sits in the Heritage Fleet collection in Sydney Harbour. Yacht NIRIMBA, an interesting project because it was done as a steel fabrication and shipbuilding project, and it was an Alan Payne designed steel hulled yacht, and the Shipwrights and Boilermaker Welder Apprentices built it between 1962 and 1966. And as I said, it was a shipbuilding and steel fabrication exercise, and it was steel framed, the whole lot. The plate was rolled and formed, and all of the fittings were made by the apprentices. Some of the machining was done by the fitters and turners, but primarily it was the Shipwrights and Boilermaker Welders exercise. And the yacht actually sailed in the Sydney to Hobart race in the 1970s, And in the 1990s, a group of apprentices spied the yacht had been sold off and was available for sale, and they formed a syndicate and purchased it and sailed it for many years on Sydney Harbour, having had to more or less give it a refit as well to get it back into the condition they wanted. Electrical trades and workshops. The electrical trades didn't have anywhere near the size of area allocated, but they had smaller workshops, and there were several of them. And there was an electrical laboratory and an electrical machine shop and a fitting shop. And the electrical apprentices did much of their training in these areas, but otherwise, in 1963, they were actually renominated as systems artificers. So instead of being electrical artificers, they became systems artificers. And from 1964, the systems artificers at NIRIMBA were actually bussed on a daily basis to Granville Tech and also Gore Hill Tech in Sydney. And the buses took them in and brought them back at night time, but they went there 4 days a week, and they did their electrical engineering certificates. So, as I mentioned previously, NIRIMBA was an evolutionary place. It was always changing, and it was all like that right up until the very end. The electrical laboratories, as I've mentioned before, they had a range of equipment in them, and some of this stuff was over in 259 building, the larger pieces of equipment, and it gave the electrical apprentices the opportunity to not only learn the basics of the electrical trade, but understand some of the operations and the skills required to run the systems that they were going to look at when they get to sea. So they got some training. It would have been really, if you like, the basics of the equipment, because every ship was different, but they had an understanding of what was going on. The bottom right-hand corner, you can see a bunch of apprentices there wearing their blazer and greys. When they went off to TAFE, they wore their blazers and greys. So they were that was their school uniform going to tech. The aircraft apprentices training. Now, this was something rather a variable thing, because in the early years, there were a lot of ups and downs. None of the first 4 aircraft artificer apprentices that came in 1956 actually finished as aircraft artificer apprentices. 2 of them changed over to become engine room artificers, and also 2 of them decided they had to leave because the federal government in 1959 disbanded the Fleet Air Arm, and as a result, there was no need for further training. In 1963, the federal government then reversed its earlier decision, and the aircraft training recommenced. And then from 62 onwards, the number of apprentices increased quite considerably. So aircraft training wasn't really a roaring success in the early days at NIRIMBA, primarily because they didn't have a great deal of equipment to use. In the early stages, obviously, the RAN didn't previously have a fleet air arm, so there were no old aircraft to use, and eventually they started to become available once the gannets became available and other aircraft, but basic equipment only. And as a result, much of the aircraft training was actually finalised down at HMAS Albatross, where the aircraft artificer apprentices were able to work on the real thing. In the 1960s, a little bit like we're going through in 2025, the Navy ordered a number of new ships. There were the Perth-class destroyers, the 2 Leander-class frigates, Swan and Torrens. There was Moresby, the destroyer tender Stalwart, which was essentially a floating workshop ship, and the attack-class patrol boats and aircraft in the Oberon-class submarines. And of course, this required a lot more people, and those people basically had to have a new set of skills. And during the 1960s, the RAN carried out a structure review. And in 1965, the structure review identified that the structure and the nature of the technical training had to change, and primarily to achieve larger numbers. You know, if you think back, NIRIMBA was bringing in somewhere between about 70 to 80 or 90 apprentices every 6 months. They needed larger numbers, and the only way they could do it was to try and change the system. So they came up with a system called SailStruct, and SailStruct was going to start in 1970. And the primary objective there was to try and get a larger number of apprentices, or if you like, technicians rather than apprentices. And they were going to be direct entry recruits coming in through service. And those direct entry recruits would go through a different training scheme altogether, which I'll mention in a moment. But the new structure required the phasing out of the original 1956 5-year apprenticeship scheme. And that had trained something like about 2,400 teenage entrants, produced highly trained trades technicians. And you've got to realise that they weren't just tradesmen, they were technicians. The nature of their training was far broader than just the actual tradesman's training. And around about roughly 208, I was able to sort of work out, and about 8.6% went on to become commissioned officers, and there were also a number of warrant officers continued on. Some of those people went on to spend something like about 40 years in the Navy. So they had long-term return from the amount of time and effort and the cost that was put into training them in the early stages. One of the things that came about was that from mid-1972, the phase training kicked in, and what that really came down to was that if you look at the bottom here, the phase one was when the recruits came into service, they were given very, very basic technical training, a little bit like the basic fitting shop, but nowhere near to the same extent that the original apprentices had. And they went off with some understanding of what the tools were, and they were done on the basis that they would have an opportunity to become tradesmen. It wasn't a guaranteed thing, although many of them thought it was at the beginning. And phase two training was once they went to sea, they were given a task book, and that task book had a whole range of different activities. You know, and they were fixing valves and working on diesel engines and working on air conditioning. And effectively, they were trades assistants working alongside the artificers on the ships, and they picked up basic skills and basic understanding. And once they finished their phase two, what they referred to as task books, and provided they had good performance records, they could be selected for a phase three trades course. And the numbers of people that could go onto these phase three trade courses were relatively limited. So as a result, not all of those apprentices managed to go on and formalise their trade training. But the phase three course was 2 years ashore, initially at NIRIMBA, and later on that moved down to HMAS service. And if you look at the top there, the accommodation improved quite dramatically. From around about 1970 onwards, NIRIMBA started to get new accommodation, new cafeteria, quite modern and, if you like, reasonably comfortable and probably not so cold and not so hot accommodation areas. And the numbers of people increased by about 1990. There were about 1,300 people there, and as a result, NIRIMBA was a very, very large training establishment. There were other people going into NIRIMBA at that stage with regards to general entry sailors. They were doing a certain amount of training there as well. So it became a more sort of diverse training establishment, but it was nowhere near like the type of training that was given to the original apprentices up until about 1972. And if you have a look at what happened to NIRIMBA, in 1994, it was decommissioned. And it had trained a very large number of apprentices and trades technicians. There were mechanicians that came from sea under a different trade training scheme. They spent time at NIRIMBA, and there were people who came from various Commonwealth navies, from Malaysia and Singapore and various places. And as a result, NIRIMBA was shut down and everything was moved to Cerberus. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, Cerberus was a large facility for training, and it had a lot of very highly specialised training facilities, including things that NIRIMBA didn't have, because they had specialist courses there as well. So Cerberus became the training establishment, the only major training establishment. And this is what NIRIMBA looked like around about 1994, when the place was cleared off and sold off, and effectively became really broken up into two areas. In the bottom area there, you can just see some of the buildings that became part of the University of Western Sydney, and also the NIRIMBA TAFE facility. And the rest of it, which was the bulk, became housing, and that's all now covered by housing everywhere. So that was the end of NIRIMBA, and that's really the end of this story. It was a long process, but it was one of those places that produced a very large number of highly skilled technicians for the Navy over many, many years. And unfortunately, the country is still now chasing numbers of people, and staff manning ships is still a major problem. And I have to acknowledge that this presentation really came about as a result of assistance and input from a whole range of people. Whilst I had recollections, there were many other things that sort of jogged my memory when people started asking questions, talking about things. I got flooded with emails and photos and a whole range of things, and learned a lot of things about NIRIMBA that I really didn't appreciate, because it's like a lot of things. When you're inside an establishment like that, you only see what you see. You don't see the entire thing. You don't get a full overview. And it's not until you sit back and look at these things that you can appreciate what really NIRIMBA was about. And it was a major training establishment that did all of the things that the Navy needed back in those days. And I think it's probably still sorely missed by many people. And that's the end of the story for today. Thank you.